Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something a little less philosophical, yet no less complicated. Viking intimacy.it was about status, strategy, and at times, shockingly public. Before we get too comfortable, don't forget to like and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of history talk. Drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing who's joining from around the globe. Now dim the lights, let the fan hum quietly in the background, and let's begin tonight's story together. First, let's clear up a myth. The Vikings were far cleaner than most people imagine. Not spotless like a spotty, but by medieval standards, they were practically walking bars of soap. While much of Europe was busy believing bathing was sinful, or just too much trouble, the Norse were washing weekly. They even made their own soap from animal fat and ash. It might have smelled a bit rustic, but compared to their neighbors, they were clouds of earthly perfume and smugness. They brushed their hair, trimmed beards, filed nails, and carried grooming kits carved from bone and iron. Imagine showing up to a longhouse date with neat braids, polished nails, and minty breath. In an age when most people still had straw under their arms, English monks complained about how attractive these annoyingly clean men were. One chronicler even claimed the Vikings' charm came from unfair soap advantage. In short, the secret weapon of Norse seduction was hygiene. But in their culture, cleanliness meant more than vanity. It symbolized dignity and rank. A free man was expected to look like one, tidy, cared for, and free of lice. To neglect yourself was to look like a servant, or worse, someone lazy and dishonorable. Bathing also held ritual meaning. Before feasts, battles, or romantic pursuits, washing was a sign of readiness to appear before gods, ancestors, or that special someone inside the longhouse. Now, forget the idea that Viking romance was just grunting and dragging someone indoors. These weren't only warriors, they were poetic souls, fluent in metaphor and mischief. Their version of flirting was skaldic poetry, a form so dense with imagery it makes Shakespeare look like a grocery note. A Viking might compare a woman's hair to glowing flax, her walk to a swan on still waters, or if things were heating up, her body to a finely forged blade. That wasn't just wooing, it was art. And it came with rules. Writing suggestive poetry about a woman without consent could actually be illegal. The Icelandic Grágis law code forbade obscene or defamatory verses. Accuse a woman of being too available through a poem, and you might end up exiled, or worse. Imagine getting challenged to a duel for a dirty limerick, and the women? They gave as good as they got. Viking women could write sharp, devastating verses of their own. If Amon's poem was clumsy or arrogant, she might roast him in public so brutally that entire families avoided eye contact for years. One saga even tells of a woman rejecting a man so cleverly in verse that he abandoned love entirely and joined a monastery. Yes, she flirted so hard he found religion. In the Viking world, poetry was both armor and weapon in matters of the heart. Still, Viking love wasn't exactly arrow and calm. Think less. Roses and candlelight. And more. I own 3 goats. Shall we merge assets? Courtship was tangled in law, family politics, and property. When a man wanted to marry, he didn't sing beneath her window. He sent his father, uncle, or the smoothest friend had to talk dowries. Because nothing says passion like livestock negotiations. Technically, a free woman could refuse a match, but whether that held up depended on her family's needs or her father's patience. Some sagas show headstrong women saying no, others hint that it was safer to run if you tried. Still, Viking law wasn't heartless. A woman forced into marriage could stand before witnesses and declare herself divorced. No court, no papers, just 3 public announcements. The medieval Norse version of shouting, "It's over!" across a feast hall. Bride kidnapping was technically illegal, though the sagas sometimes romanticized it. Proof that even Vikings struggled with mixed messages about love. Then came the concubines, known legally as bed thralls. These women, often enslaved, were expected to serve in both household and bed, and consent was rarely part of the equation. Still, wives held surprising power. If a husband failed emotionally or physically, she could leave. Norse women didn't suffer silently. They made noise, and the law had their back. As for premarital relationships, the Norse were shockingly open-minded. While much of Europe obsessed over chastity, the Vikings took a pragmatic view. A woman's worth wasn't defined by purity but by skill, honor, and reputation. As long as you didn't start public scandals or affairs with someone else's spouse, your private life was your business. Some sagas even praised bold women who went after what, or who, they wanted. Life was hard. Winters were longer. Competence and courage mattered more than virtue tales. Still, discretion was advised. Boasting about past lovers could lead to legal trouble. Public gossip about a partner without her consent was both rude and punishable. In short, the Vikings valued freedom and dignity, as long as no one turned it into drama at feast. And if you think modern romance gets complicated, wait until we meet the Norse gods, a celestial caste where shape-shifting, cross-dressing, and divine soap operas were just another Tuesday. Let's begin with Frey, the god of fertility. Frey was anything but discreet. He was often portrayed as a god with, let's say, unrestrained enthusiasm for his physician. His sacred idol reportedly included impressively confident anatomy, and his ceremonies celebrated fertility, affection, and rather symbolic crops. If you were looking for a god of restraint, Frey wouldn't make the shortlist. Then came Loki, the eternal troublemaker. In one tale, Loki morphs into a mare, a female horse, to distract a magical stallion. The plan works a little too well, and Loki ends up pregnant, later giving birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. This whole event is treated less like divine chaos and more like an oddly charming side note in mythology. In another saga, Thor disguises himself as a bride to recover his stolen hammer. His costume, a wedding gown and a veil. His strategy, grunting convincingly and hoping no one questions the bearded bride. Spoiler, it fails, but the hammer is retrieved and everyone leaves confused yet relieved. So, why mention these stories? Because the Vikings didn't see love, gender, or sexuality as tidy boxes. Their myths were gloriously chaotic, fluid, wild, and completely inappropriate by modern standards. Many Norse gods and heroes entered relationships that modern law professors would need entire seminars to explain. The line between affection and absurdity was razor thin, and their gods rode across it frequently, sometimes literally on horseback. Here's the thing, none of this shocked them. Fertility, passion, deception, these were sacred forces. The gods acted improperly not out of malice but because life itself was messy. Sometimes, wisdom came from a shape-shifting horse mother. Viking society had rules, many of them, but gender and relationships existed in gray areas. In short, do as you please, just don't appear unmanly doing it. Here's what that meant. For Viking men, the worst insult wasn't being a thief, coward, or liar, it was being Kallidirgi, a word so insulting it could start duels. Being labeled urgy meant you were passive or failed to embody expected masculinity, especially in the romantic sense. It wasn't about who you were with, but how you behaved. Yielding was weakness, and weakness shattered reputation faster than a leaky longship. Women, however, had more flexibility. Though society was male-dominated, women had rights that would make many media vulnerable women jealous. They could own property, file for divorce, and express their preferences openly. Still, social expectations ran deep. A woman too bold might be deemed masculine, but oddly enough, that wasn't always negative. Some saga heroines earned respect for their sharp wit and fighting skill, while men showing the same emotional traits risked ridicule, or even accusations of witchcraft. Practicing Seder, a Norse magical ritual tied to motion and foresight, was considered women's work. If a man performed it, he was mocked as delicate or deceitful. The irony? Odin himself, the All-Father, was a master of Seder. But when he used it, it was called strategy. When anyone else did, it was shameful. A classic case of divine privilege. In Viking culture, words carried the same weight as weapons. A single insult could get you killed. If someone questioned your manhood or your prowess, you could legally challenge them to a duel. One wrong joke, and you might end up half-dressed in the forest, sword in hand, defending your honor because someone hinted you were less than enthusiastic under the firs. These verbal offenses were known as a category of slander so grave it called justified bloodshed. Calling someone a rag, accusing them of being immanly, was a death-worthy insult. Say it, and you'd better be ready to fight. Lose the duel or fail to prove your words, and you might be the one exiled. Reputation ruled everything. These were close-knit communities where image meant survival. A rumor about weakness or romantic failure could destroy your standing. Ironically, most feuds weren't over what truly happened. They stemmed from gossip or a misplaced joke. Viking society had no patience for casual shade. But beneath all this chaos lay a truth: intimacy and public image were inseparable. A man's romantic reputation defined his power. Lose that, and you lost your seat at the feast. In their world, love and loyalty were fine until someone got caught with the neighbor's spouse. Then came the shouting, lawsuits, and occasionally, the stabbing. Adultery, while frowned upon, wasn't equally punished. A cheating wife faced severe consequences: divorce, humiliation, or worse, depending on how offended her husband felt. The lover often met a very final end. For unfaithful husbands, consequences were looser. Sleeping with an unmarried woman? Usually forgiven. But another man's wife? That could spark bloodshed, especially if her husband had brothers. On the other hand, Viking wives weren't powerless. They could file for divorce, reclaim their property, and walk away, sometimes with the children, livestock, and house keys. The Norse legal code required evidence for accusations, meaning witnesses or being caught in the act, which led to some awkward mealtime discoveries. Revenge, though technically illegal, was common. Broken doors, torched barns, or hunting accidents often followed infidelity. Yet, despite the danger, people still cheated. Humans remained predictable. Viking adultery law wasn't about virtue but about honor and assets. Who was shamed, who was slain, and who kept the goats. Forget scarlet letters. Adultery led to duels, lawsuits, and messy property disputes. Of course, not all Viking romance relied in charm or swordsmanship. Sometimes they used magic, specifically Seidr, pronounced Seidr. Part prophecy, part emotional manipulation, and part I'll hex my ex if I must. It was a blend of sorcery and psychology. It called curse rivals, predict weather, or bend someone's heart. If your affection wasn't returned, a little Seidr might convince them otherwise, by fate or by fear. But again, this was considered a feminine craft. Women practiced it openly as vulvas, wise women enchantments. Men risked being mocked for even trying. Odin, famously, was teased for mastering Seidr. His enemies taunted. Great spell, mighty one, but a bit embarrassing, don't you think? Odin, of course, didn't care. When you've got one eye and a pair of ravens, judgment loses its sting. Love spells ranged from sweet herbal charms to intimidating enchantments. Think, drink this tea and fall for me. Mixed with, or your cattle may not survive winter. As always, the Vikings never did anything halfway. Naturally, there were dangers. Being caught using spells to sway someone's heart, especially without consent, could end badly, both in law and in legend. People believed that misused sorcery could rebound like a poorly carved boomerang, and the last thing anyone wanted was a love charm turning into a full-scale village crisis. Still, for the bold with herbs and cedar smoke, options existed. Not everyone could compose romantic poetry, but anyone could try a charm and hope for the best. Modern lovers rely on candlelight and playlists. Vikings relied on firelight, livestock noises, and several relatives pretending not to notice. Privacy, as we know it, did not exist. Viking longhouses were vast communal halls where entire families ate, worked, and slept together, not from choice, but for warmth. Parents, grandparents, children, servants, and even animals shared one room. Walls were optional, curtains rare, and personal space an unspoken myth. So when romance struck, couples didn't retreat to cozy chambers. They rolled closer to the fire, pulled up a fur, and tried to ignore Uncle Bjorn snoring a few feet away. Hardly romantic, but highly efficient. Despite this lack of seclusion, Viking society was unbothered. Intimacy happened, sometimes within earshot, sometimes beside the stew pot, and everyone practiced the art of strategic pretending. You didn't acknowledge it, didn't comment, definitely didn't make eye contact. You just stared into the flames and thought about fish. Wealthier families might hang tapestries or partitions, the Norse equivalent of a "do not disturb" sign, but most relied on timing and luck. Modesty wasn't an obsession. Physical closeness was a fact of life, accepted but not discussed, especially when elders were nearby. Contraception, as far as Vikings were concerned, was a mix of herbs, patience, and hope. There was no manual titled "How to Avoid Parenthood While Pillaging," but evidence suggests they had some knowledge. Women used plants like juniper, mugwort, and wild carrot, all believed to reduce fertility. Did they work? Perhaps. Did they taste dreadful? Absolutely. Extended breastfeeding was also common to space out pregnancies, pragmatic, if not romantic. Unlike later religious societies, Vikings didn't link intimacy solely with procreation. Pleasure mattered too. The sagas depict couples falling in love, growing apart, even divorcing, a refreshingly realistic view of human connection. If contraception failed, the burden usually fell on women. Men might navigate by stars and ravens, but herbal knowledge wasn't their domain. As for same-sex relationships, yes, they existed, though bound by strict social codes. Viking masculinity hinged on dominance, not morality. The man perceived as passive risked ridicule, or even a duel to restore his honor. Reputation, not love, was at stake. Women's relationships drew less attention. They didn't disrupt inheritance or social order and were often quietly tolerated. The Norse gods themselves were fluid. Loki changed forms freely, reminding mortals that divinity didn't fear ambiguity, even if humans did. Marriage among Vikings was both practical and symbolic, a union of families, property, and politics. But ending it was surprisingly simple. A woman could declare divorce aloud, before witnesses, at the home's threshold or bedside, citing reasons from cruelty to poetic incompetence. Once said, the marriage was over. Property and children were divided according to custom. Women often kept their dowries and could remarry freely. Divorce didn't ruin reputations, it just reset the saga. Of course, some breakups sparked drama, feuds, or duels, but the principle stood: when it was over, it was over. Men could do the same, usually citing disobedience, revealing much about expectations of the era. Weddings, meanwhile, were theatrical affairs lasting up to a week, filled with feasting, politics, and smoked fish. The bride's hair was unbraided to mark her new status. The groom reclaimed his ancestral sword, a promise of protection, or perhaps a subtle warning. And then came consummation, not just encouraged, but required. In some places, it even had to be witnessed. Because for all their fierce independence, the Vikings never did anything halfway, not even love. In certain ceremonies, a few uneasy relatives waited outside the room, torches flickering, making sure the couple fulfilled their vows rather than collapsing from nerves or too much mead. Why? Because weddings weren't just romantic gestures, they sealed contracts. Marriage shaped land rights, inheritance, and alliances. If the union wasn't properly consummated, future claims could be disputed. Far easier to confirm things discreetly from behind a curtain and avoid eye contact later. Of course, not all weddings were that intense. In more modest communities, everyone simply assumed the deed was done, or relied on the morning's boasting over breakfast stew for proof. Rituals often featured hammers invoking Thor, shared drinking horns, solemn vows, and plenty of ale. The term, honeymoon, came from drinking honey wine for a full moon cycle after the ceremony, a sweet, sticky blessing for fertility. By now, it's clear Viking intimacy wasn't just raw conquest. It was layered, deliberate, poetic, tinged with superstition, and sometimes performed disturbingly close to livestock. Norse people didn't see sex as sinful. It was practical, sacred, and woven into daily life alongside farming, raiding, and the occasional suspicion that your neighbor might curse you. Passion had its place, but it was bound by law, honor, and community expectations. Falling in love meant earning approval from relatives, livestock, and 3 heavily armed uncles. Romance was rarely private, it was communal. The sagas overflow with clever women, jealous rivals, and emotionally detached men. Some tales end in marriage feasts, others end with betrayals, duels, or fires. Yet Viking women were never mere bystanders. They negotiated, seduced, divorced, hexed, and sometimes literally burned bridges. Admired for intellect, feared for curses, they were immortalized in poetry, the Norse form of flattery. Even the gods mirrored this chaos. Loki swapped genders, Frey flaunted fertility, and Odin practiced love magic without shame. Divine love was fierce, unpredictable, and never modest. So, what was intimacy like in Viking lands? Communal, poetic, complex, part law, part survival. It could elevate your honor or ruin it. It appeared in public at the worst times yet seemed progressive in spirit. True to Norse nature, it wasn't about perfection but endurance, surviving love with your pride, your home, and your sword arm intact. Now, shift to the life of medieval peasants. Don't picture cozy fireside holidays. Holy days were work in disguise. Religious observances filled the year, and while they looked like rest from toil, they often meant cooking for the village, fixing roofs, or chasing livestock gone rogue during festivals. Still, it was better than digging turnips. The church granted dozens of feast days: Christmas, Easter, saints' celebrations, Marian feasts, and bizarre local honors like St. Gertrude's toenail. These weren't optional breaks but sacred pauses demanding attendance at Mass and reflection on one's sins. Yet peasants, ever practical, turned holy days into excuses for feasting, laughter, and questionable sobriety. Yule, for example, stretched for 12 full days of ale-soaked storytelling and roasted meat, a medieval Netflix binge with a side of community service. Lords might suspend rent, but they'd expect your family to serve at their tables. Holidays blurred sacred duty with unpaid labor. Still, they bound communities together. Villagers dressed in their least filthy tunics, shared meager food, and pretended, for one fleeting day, that life wasn't all toil and taxes. Holidays existed, plenty of them, but never without strings. Attend Mass, skip the plow, and avoid being caught napping in the loft unless you wanted a sermon and penance. Yule, the most enchanting time of year. Assuming your idea of enchantment included roasting carcasses, evergreens nailed to beams, and drunk relatives in haystacks. For peasants, Yule lasted 12 boisterous days between Christmas and Epiphany when rules relaxed and even the poorest felt festive. It began on Christmas Eve with the Yule log, an entire tree dragged into the hearth and burned throughout the celebration. Its ashes brought luck, which was handy since keeping a log aflame for 12 days bordered on arson. Feasting varied. Generous lords offered meat and ale, others made do with salted bread and mystery stew. Everyone sang, off-key, in masks that hinted at older pagan customs, evergreens for eternal life, disguises to frighten spirits or rats. Sometimes a lord of misrule, usually the village fool, ruled the festivities, mocking nobles and flipping social order until January restored reality. Despite the chaos, Yule was sacred, warmth against darkness, laughter against hunger, proof that joy survived. Then came January 6th, the ale soured, the pig bones vanished, and roofs demanded patching. If Yule was about fire and feasting, May Day was its flowery opposite, a celebration of spring, color, and fertility, not just of crops. The 1st of May meant dawn gatherings, music, and mischief. Villagers ventured into the woods to fetch May branches, blossoms, and occasionally trouble. Young couples often returned more disheveled than when they left, proof that nature's renewal wasn't limited to the fields. Elders might have lifted a skeptical brow, but no one really objected. A few extra infants showing up in early February were simply part of the village's natural rhythm. At the center of the festivities stood the maypole, a tall wooden post set in the village green, draped with ribbons, flowers, and enough local meaning to make any scholar blush. Villagers danced around it in patterns and circles, laughing, sweating, and politely ignoring that it was clearly a fertility symbol lingering from old pagan customs. The church frowned upon it, of course, but never quite enough to put a stop to the dancing. Even Father Bartholomew was sometimes caught tapping his foot. The air pulsed with music, drums, flutes, and if fortune failed you, bagpipes. There were plays, races, wrestling bouts, and even fire-jumping contests to prove bravery or win a year of luck. Beneath all the symbolism, nature's renewal, the promise of harvest, lay a simple truth: it was one glorious excuse to have fun. Peasants who wore rags all year dug out their least tattered garments, adorned themselves with garlands, and crowned a May Queen, a symbol of youth and spring, often defined by having most of her teeth and no obvious boils. Unlike church holidays, May Day wasn't chained to bells or scripture. It predated saints and sermons alike, celebrating body and spirit together. Though the local lord might still demand labor the next morning, for that one flower-filled day, even the poorest soul could dance like they owned the meadow. Medieval Europe overflowed with saints, each with their own feast day. You might imagine this meant endless parties, and technically it did, though it was more like celebrating your saintly Greytant's martyrdom every other day. Welcome to the organized chaos of holy festivals. Peasants adored feast days, not out of deep faith, but because they granted a guilt-free break from work and an abundance of food. A typical celebration began with Mass, then hours of drinking, singing, and storytelling. Picture processions bearing relics, mystery plays acted in muddy fields, barrels of ale cracked before noon, and that one barefoot man shouting about St. Blaise's miraculous fish-bone extraction. Every village had its own patron saint: Saint Isidore for farmers, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, or some obscure local healer who allegedly cured leprosy and hiccups. No matter the saint, the day honored their memory with prayer, ritual, and sometimes roasted goat. Villages boasting relics, a bone, a shred of cloth, or an authentic eyeball of Saint Agnes, turned feast days into full festivals. Pilgrims arrived, merchants set up stalls, and the local youth staged clumsy plays about the saint's life, complete with collapsing props and forgotten lines. Best of all, no one had to toil in the fields. Sure, you might fetch water for the communal stew or play trumpet badly in a parade, but it was light duty, and you'd earn a bit of meat and gossip. The clergy kept watch, wary of too much wine or dancing turning holy celebration into peasant rave. Yet most priests agreed, joyful chaos was better than despair. If raucous songs about St. Bridget helped morale, then so be it. Before Lent, that 40-day drought of joy and butter, came Carnival, or Shrovetide, a season of blessed disorder. Think medieval spring break, but with turnips instead of tequila. It erupted right before Ash Wednesday, serving as a pressure valve for the soul. If you were about to live like a monk, you first partied like a heretic. Masks came out, grotesque, animal, or demonic, transforming peasants into devils, kings, and talking pigs. Cross-dressing, crude songs mocking nobles, mock parades crowning the village fool as king of misrule. For a brief moment, social lines blurred. The feasting was wild. Everything forbidden during Lent had to go: meat, butter, cheese, devoured in one last indulgent blaze. Pancakes, sausages, and dripping pastries filled every table. Games followed, flower fights, mock battles, and drunken jests with cabbages tied to sticks. The prize was pride, not profit. The church scowled at the chaos but knew better than to cancel it. Carnival was more than fun, it was release. A rare moment when peasants could laugh at their masters and feel, if only fleetingly, free. Then came Ash Wednesday. The masks burned, music died, and silence returned. Meat vanished. Bells tolled. The same villagers who danced bare-chested by fire now knelt hungry in pews. But the memory of Carnival stayed, a whisper that joy, like wine, must be savored while it lasts. And what do you get when religion, theater, and enthusiastic but semi-literate farmers collide? Mystery plays, the medieval blockbuster. Long before Netflix or Shakespeare, villagers gathered to watch neighbors reenact Bible stories in homespun robes and hay-bound sandals. Mystery came from ministerium, meaning craft or guild, since local tradesmen produced them. The bakers might stage the Last Supper, the butchers, the crucifixion, with actual pig's blood for realism. These performances, held on feast days, transformed marketplaces into sacred theaters. Crowds stood ankle-deep in mud to watch Genesis unfold on wagon stages rolling through town, each depicting a different biblical scene. The results were often more comic than holy. Noah's wife became a stubborn drunk refusing the ark, devils chased sinners through the crowd to roars of laughter, and tyrants earned tomatoes for their speeches. The line between devotion and entertainment was thin. Yet despite the chaos, these plays carried faith to those who couldn't read, proof that laughter, too, could be divine. They were lessons in disguise. Most peasants couldn't read, and Latin sermons might as well have been birdsong. Mystery plays made scripture come alive, vivid, emotional, unforgettable. A man wearing a thorn crown, crying out in pain, etched the story deeper than any scroll ever could. And they united people. Costumes, props, rehearsals, all demanded teamwork. Entire villages joined forces to make them happen. Even when an angel forgot his lines or St. Peter's beard went up in flames, the chaos was holy, and holy theirs. In medieval peasant life, weddings weren't private matters. They were the village's biggest, most legitimate excuse for a grand celebration. Officially, a sacrament. Spiritually, a vow. Practically, a festival where ale flowed like rivers and cloaks mysteriously changed owners. Marriage for peasants was duty first, affection later. Families arranged matches for land, labor, or livestock. A dowry might include a pig, some barley, or a decently groomed goat. Love was optional. Strong sons were required. The ceremony itself was modest, brief, outdoors, usually at the church door. Witnesses stood close, blessings were given, and music, if any, came from a wheezing fiddle or old Joffrey whistling through his missing teeth. Then came the real joy, the feast. Everyone was welcome, kin, neighbors, and the perpetually late thatcher. Guests brought what they could, bread, eggs, maybe a roasted bird if generosity struck. The bride's family provided most of the food, which might mean one weary chicken boiled with turnips and rebranded as stew. Dancing followed, wild, muddy, endless. These weren't delicate waltzes but stomping, spinning, chaotic affairs. Someone always fell in the fire. The musicians played whatever instruments survived the first round. Jokes about in-laws flew, bawdy songs echoed, and contests tested who could drink fastest or guess how many children the couple would have before harvest. Eventually, the newlyweds were escorted, literally, to bed by the entire village. The bedding involved laughter, awkward chanting, and theatrical blessings. Curtains closed, and 9 months later, another reason to feast. Despite the many holidays dotting the medieval calendar, peasants soon discovered a harsh truth. Holy days didn't always mean rest. Often they meant different work, with slightly better food and more singing. Sure, the fields paused, and oxen got a break, but that roof still leaked, and the priest's barn wasn't going to sweep itself. Someone had to cook the communal stew, mostly onions and hope. Feast days meant service, not sloth. Take St. Swithin's Day. No plowing, great, but now you're building a flower arch or acting as Roman soldier number 2 in a play. Later, you're stirring a cauldron while Father Bartholomew critiques your seasoning. Even the 12 days of Yule weren't pure leisure. Someone had to chop wood, brew ale, roast the questionable boar, and keep the Yule log burning. Failure meant bad omens, maybe even plague. Children fetched herbs or delivered bread, while elders spun stories that ideally didn't end in fire, pestilence, or scapegoats, though those were crowd favorites. Some towns disguised chores as holidays. Church cleaning day doubled as a saint's feast. If a lord wanted a moat cleared or a banner sewn before his banquet, guess who volunteered? Still, feast day work came with perks, better food, shared ale, and collective grumbling. Nothing built unity like hauling a rotten log together. Life for peasants was harsh, but not joyless. Their year overflowed with festivals, saints' feasts, and weddings, enough to overwhelm any modern planner. These weren't just pauses in hardship, they gave life rhythm and meaning. Winter brought Yule fires and candlelit stories. Spring returned May Day's blossoms and bonfires. Summer carried saint processions and fairs, and maybe, just maybe, a decent meal from the manor. Autumn closed with harvest festivals, quieter but satisfying. After long months of toil, People gathered to thank heaven that famine or locusts had passed them by. Dancing, ale, and questionable roasting followed. No one complained. Even fasting seasons had purpose. They made the feast sweeter, the joy sharper. While the church dreamed of humble repentance, most peasants just endured thin broth until the next celebration. Joy lay not only in the feasting, but in preparing for it, brewing ale, sewing ribbons, rehearsing plays. These were acts of faith and hope. Together, they stitched laughter, song, and shared purpose into lives otherwise ruled by mud and hunger. Whether dancing around a maypole, tumbling off a stage wagon, or burning fingers on a Yule log, peasants learned to celebrate both the absurd and the divine. They needed little, just time, community, and a reason to raise a mug and cry, "Bless Saint whoever, we survived another year." Saladin, known in his time as Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was born in 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq. A humble beginning in a land forever at war. His Kurdish family wasn't noble, but they weren't poor either. His father, Ayyub, served as an officer for the powerful Zengid dynasty, which ruled much of Syria and northern Iraq. No one looked at the young Yusuf and thought, "There goes the future conqueror of Jerusalem." Unlike most warlords, he wasn't raised among swords and scars. He grew up in Baalbek and Damascus, learning theology, mathematics, law, and poetry. He studied the Quran with devotion and developed a lifelong love of knowledge. Quiet, thoughtful, and pious, he seemed better suited to scholarship than battle. But the world around him was restless. Crusaders still held Jerusalem. Muslim lands were divided by rivalry, Sunni and Shia rulers feuding over power, alliances shifting like desert winds. Into this turmoil stepped Saladin, not as a conqueror, but as a loyal soldier under his uncle Shirkuh, a hardened general serving Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Aleppo. The legend had begun. By this stage, no one truly foresaw greatness in Saladin. Intelligent, disciplined, and deeply devout, yes, but hardly charismatic or seasoned in battle. He had never been groomed for command. In truth, when first dispatched to Egypt alongside his uncle Shirkuh, some accounts imply he went unwillingly. His heart leaned toward faith, not warfare. Politics felt tedious to him. Yet destiny, as it often does, intervened. When Egypt opened its gates, so did the path to power. What made Saladin remarkable wasn't hunger for rule, but humility in wielding it when it came. He entered history's stage quietly, a nephew, an aide, a modest man in a noisy world. Somehow, that quiet soul would rewrite history. He hadn't marched into Egypt seeking a throne. He wanted nothing of the sort. During the 1160s, Egypt lay under the waning Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia regime drowning in unrest, famine, and endless intrigue. As crusaders and rival Muslim powers circled, Nur al-Din dispatched his trusted general, Saladin's uncle, Shirkuh, to restore stability. The dutiful nephew followed, meant only to assist, not to lead. But fate had other designs. After years of tangled campaigns, whispered betrayals, and conveniently timed, natural deaths, Shirkuh seized Cairo, and promptly died. The sword had barely cooled before the question rose: who now takes command? Enter Saladin. The court expected a compliant figurehead, a mild, pious man lacking ambition. Perfectly harmless. But within months, Saladin proved otherwise. He moved swiftly, consolidating control in Cairo through diplomacy, faith, and skill. Quietly, he dismantled the Fatimid Caliphate from within, pledging Egypt's loyalty to the Sunni Abbasids of Baghdad. 2 centuries of Fatimid rule ended, without mass executions or palace bloodshed. Mercy, however, did not mean softness. Saladin purged corruption, stabilized Egypt's finances, repaired infrastructure, and surrounded himself with scholars and judges. He lowered food costs for the poor and restored order to a weary land. To Egypt, he brought calm, to outsiders, a clear signal: this land had a true leader. Still, he called himself Nur al-Din's servant. Yet tension simmered. The apprentice's power grew, the master grew wary. Egypt was no longer a distant outpost, it was the heart of a rising realm. Though he had not sought the throne, once upon it, he ruled with intent. The hesitant savior had become a sultan in all but name, and the wider Muslim world was beginning to notice. Saladin's next challenge came not from crusaders but from his own. Having unified Egypt, he faced a fractured Islamic landscape. The Seljuk Empire had splintered. In Syria, his former mentor Nur al-Din now viewed him with suspicion. Elsewhere, local rulers squabbled for scraps while Jerusalem remained under Crusader rule. In theory, they shared one faith. In practice, they could scarcely plan a meal together, much less a holy war. In 1174, Nur al-Din died suddenly. Another vacuum, another call. Saladin stepped in, presenting himself as the guardian of Nur al-Din's legacy, even marrying into his family. But truthfully, he was finished being anyone's subordinate. He advanced north, captured Damascus with little resistance, and began carefully reuniting the Islamic world through alliances, marriages, diplomacy, and, when needed, siegecraft. Aleppo resisted, so did Mosul. But gradually, the map stitched together under his rule. Unlike most rulers of his day, Saladin earned respect rather than fear. He forgave rivals, honored treaties, and made it difficult even for enemies to despise him. His was a quiet revolution, not built on greed or glory, but on conviction that unity was sacred. He believed Muslims could not reclaim Jerusalem while divided. By the late 1170s, Saladin ruled Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, a realm forged through patience and vision rather than conquest alone. Yet his greatest test awaited him, one marked by the cross. For though he had united kingdoms, Jerusalem remained in foreign hands, the dream of every believer unfulfilled. By the 1180s, Saladin's gaze turned fully toward the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. The holy city had been under Crusader control for nearly 9 decades, a wound festering in the soul of Islam. Reclaiming it would require timing, preparation, and above all, a cause to rally every faction behind him. That cause came from the Crusaders themselves. Among their ranks stood Reynold of Chatillon, a man so reckless he made other lords seem monks by comparison. He repeatedly broke truces, raided Muslim caravans, and even threatened the holy cities. To Saladin, his actions were more than insults, they were divine justification. When Reynold attacked a caravan in 1187 during a peace, Saladin declared war. The Crusaders gathered their forces under King Guy of Lusignan, marching into the blistering Galilean plains toward Tiberias. Saladin let them come, cutting off their access to water. By the time they reached the twin hills of Hattin, they were dehydrated and trapped. On July 4, 1187, Saladin struck. The Battle of Hattin was a masterstroke. The Crusader army destroyed, their sacred true cross captured, King Guy taken, and Reynold executed for his crimes. The Crusader state's might was broken, the road to Jerusalem lay open, but what would Saladin do when he arrived? Most conquerors answered with blood and fire. Saladin chose mercy. In the months after Hattin, his armies swept across the Levant. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, all surrendered with little struggle. And on October 2, 1187, he stood before Jerusalem itself. The city's defender, Balian of Ibelin, pleaded for clemency, warning of ruin if the city were stormed. Saladin refused vengeance. He accepted peaceful surrender, and in that moment, Saladin's legacy was not forged in conquest, but in restraint. Unlike the bloody conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, when Crusaders butchered tens of thousands, Saladin's entrance nearly a century later was measured and merciful. There was no mass killing, no desecration of churches, no rivers of blood. He offered Christians the chance to ransom themselves and their loved ones, freeing many, especially the poor, without payment. Saladin even covered the ransom for hundreds who couldn't afford it. Christian clergy were allowed to remain and hold services. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stood untouched. Holy sites were safeguarded, not merely for politics, but from deep conviction. For Saladin, mercy was not weakness, it was justice. Jerusalem, sacred to all 3 faiths, was not to be soaked in vengeance. To him, true faith meant mastering power without cruelty. His restraint astonished Europe. Even hostile chroniclers wrote of him with reluctant admiration, some comparing him favorably to their own kings. By reclaiming Jerusalem, Saladin achieved the impossible, reversing decades of Crusader dominance with honor intact. The city was his, but the world began to see that his strength lay not in the sword he carried, but in the one he chose not to draw. The humiliation stung Christian Europe. News of Jerusalem's fall thundered across the continent. Popes demanded retribution, monarchs gathered armies, and at their head stood Richard the Lionheart, King of England, a warrior whose fame rivaled Saladin's. Thus began the Third Crusade, a clash not only of armies, but of ideals. Saladin, the measured and merciful Sultan, faced Richard, the fiery, brilliant tactician hungry for victory. The two never met face to face, yet their duel became legendary. Richard landed in the Holy Land in 1191, capturing Acre after a brutal siege. When negotiations failed, he executed 2,700 Muslim prisoners in cold blood. Saladin, who had spared Christians in Jerusalem, was enraged but did not retaliate. Instead, he tightened discipline and focused on outmaneuvering his foe. They fought at Arsuf, where Richard claimed a tactical win but failed to crush Saladin's forces. Their campaigns became masterclasses in strategy, Richard daring and relentless, Saladin composed and patient. Yet this was more than a war of steel, it was a war of principle. Richard's bravery was shadowed by ruthlessness. Saladin, though fierce in battle, never lost his humanity, sending physicians to treat Richard when illness struck. Despite his victories, Richard never reached Jerusalem. Weather, supply shortages, and Saladin's defenses kept him at bay. Both men knew the truth, either could defeat the other. In 1192, peace came. The Treaty of Jaffa allowed Christian pilgrims entry to Jerusalem, but left the city in Muslim hands. It was compromise, not conquest, but both sides honored it. Saladin had protected the holy city without destroying it. Richard returned home a hero, but Jerusalem remained Muslim. Two lions had clashed, and only one kept the crown. Saladin's fame as a general was immense, but his true greatness lay in character. Unlike most rulers, he shunned cruelty and flattery. He was devout, humble, and strikingly modest for a man who ruled from Egypt to Mesopotamia. He slept on mats, gave away his wealth, and wept at sermons. There were no golden palaces, no vanity, only a ruler who saw power as a test, not a trophy. He fasted beyond Ramadan, studied scripture as intently as strategy, and prayed both before and after battle, not for triumph, but for the fallen. When urged to punish his foes harshly, he often refused. "Victory lies in forgiveness," he said, and lived by it. After Jerusalem's conquest, he could have razed churches, executed captives, and marched in triumph. Instead, he spared holy places, freed prisoners, and granted safe passage even to the destitute. He gave charity to Jews and maintained peace with Eastern Christians. His generosity knew no borders, paying dowries for orphan girls, building schools, hospitals, and fountains. His court glimmered not with gold, but with scholars and poets. Yet Saladin was no naive saint. He understood politics and power better than most monarchs. He knew when to strike and when to wait. He wielded fear sparingly but effectively. When he executed Reynold of Chatillon, it was not vengeance, it was justice, swift and clean. Saladin led not just armies, but hearts. His faith was sincere, his mercy deliberate, his restraint powerful. He became that rarest of figures, a ruler admired by allies, enemies, and historians alike. But even legends fade. In 1193, a few months after peace with Richard, Saladin fell ill. He was only 55, worn down by years of war, diplomacy, and devotion. The man who once rode across deserts now lay fevered in bed. He summoned no generals, hoarded no treasure. Instead, he prayed, recited the Quran, and gave away what little he owned. When he died, his treasury held only 1 dinar and 47 dirhams, too little even to fund his funeral. The Sultan who ruled empires left behind nothing but a name worth more than gold. His death was quiet, no betrayal, no poison, just peace. He was buried in Damascus, near the Grand Mosque, not in marble splendor but in a simple tomb draped with cloth. Centuries later, Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany visited and donated a new casket of marble. Even European royalty, long after the Crusades, paid tribute. Saladin's empire fractured after his death, his unity held only by his presence. Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia drifted apart. Yet his memory endured. In the Muslim world, he embodied righteous rule, a warrior of faith and justice. In the Christian world, he was the rare enemy admired and even revered. Medieval chroniclers called him noble, wise, almost saintly, titles seldom granted to infidels. It was said he kept a burial shroud beside his bed, a reminder that no wealth or crown would follow him to the grave, and yet, centuries later, his name still does. Saladin died in 1193, but his legend never did. In fact, it only grew, across lands, across faiths, and across time. Unlike most medieval monarchs who faded into obscurity or infamy, Saladin endured in memory as something close to legend, a figure of both strength and mercy, conviction and restraint, might and modesty. Across the Islamic world, he became the embodiment of just rule. For generations, caliphs and sultans would speak his name to validate their thrones, though few ever equaled his discipline or dignity. His notion of jihad was not born of zealotry but of duty. He fought to safeguard his people and lands, not to exalt himself. He governed with justice, advised by scholars, and left this world with little to his name. To many, he became the golden measure, the image of the perfect Muslim sovereign that others aspired to imitate. Yet what makes Saladin truly remarkable is that even his enemies came to revere him. Despite being the great adversary of the Crusades, European chroniclers and poets wrote of him in tones of admiration. Dante placed him among the noble pagans in his Divine Comedy, a rare tribute in a Christian vision of the afterlife. Boccaccio praised his generosity, and over the centuries, Saladin's name transformed into that of a chivalric ideal in Western literature. By the 19th century, European leaders evoked him as the standard of honorable warfare, even as they waged battles across the Middle East. His reputation outlasted his empire. In modern history, Arab nationalists revived his image as a symbol of resistance and unity. Statues of him still rise in Damascus and Cairo. His name adorns streets, schools, and even tanks. To his people, he remains not only a hero of conquest but a bridge, a man who earned respect from both allies and foes. Perhaps that is Saladin's truest legacy, not merely that he reclaimed Jerusalem, or humbled crusader kings, but that he showed it was possible, even in an age drenched in steel and blood, to fight with honor, to rule with mercy, and to leave behind not fear, but reverence. He died a sultan, but he was remembered as something infinitely greater. The Yoshiwara district in Edo was more than a quarter. It was an entire realm, walled in wood and suspended between illusion and desire. Formerly authorized by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1617, it was intended to confine pleasure within boundaries, to regulate temptation rather than erase it. What blossomed instead was a glittering dreamscape, painted faces, whispering silks, and tragic romances that flickered behind paper screens. At its center stood the courtesans, not mere sellers of affection, but artists and icons of refinement. The highest among them, the Oiran, were paragons of culture. They studied poetry, music, calligraphy, and the delicate theater of seduction. They wore layers of embroidered kimono, hair adorned with ornaments as elaborate as weaponry, every gesture choreographed to perfection. A glance from an Oiran could bankrupt a man, a word, even more. From afar, it seemed a paradise of beauty and grace. Inside, it was a cage gilded with gold. Most who entered Yoshiwara did so not by choice, but by poverty. Sold as children, their futures were signed away in contracts that lasted decades, their identities rewritten to fit the market. Freedom was a rumor carried by the wind outside the gates. These women were celebrated as masters of charm, admired for their wit and poise, yet bound by silk instead of chains. For the patrons, Yoshiwara offered illusion as much as intimacy. Samurai could lay down their swords. Merchants could imagine themselves poets, and everyone could step outside their rank for one. fleeting night. But illusions fade with dawn. Names were forgotten, and any spark of love was left to wilt in memory. True affection was perilous here, forbidden. Even a courtesan who fell in love risked punishment, or worse, being sold to another house. A samurai who loved beneath his class faced disgrace. And still, love found ways to bloom in shadows, whispered stories of secret vows and doomed passions drifting like smoke through narrow streets. This was Yoshiwara's contradiction, a place that sold love but punished it when it became real. Beyond those gates, outsiders often mistook geisha for courtesans. But within Yoshiwara, the difference was sacred. Courtesans were licensed for pleasure, but revered like stars. Their clients paid not for touch alone, but for the illusion of being desired, a living poem wrapped in silk. Winning their favor required patience, wealth, and persistence. Only the elite could hope to succeed. Geisha, by contrast, were entertainers, not lovers. They performed music, composed poetry, and poured sake with precision. Their allure was art itself. To mistake one for the other was an insult, a breach of the unspoken code that governed the pleasure quarter. A geisha might tease, dance, or flirt, but if a man expected more, he would be laughed out of the room. Yet beneath these careful boundaries lay a shared truth: freedom was mostly illusion. Few women entered by ambition. Many were sold, orphaned, or trapped by poverty. Even the most celebrated were bound by debt, by contract, by reputation. Leaving required a patron wealthy enough to purchase her release. A transaction called mizuge.it could be salvation, or merely a new kind of captivity. Still, within those confines, women carved out small rebellions. A sly remark, a forbidden glance, a poem slipped into a sleeve. Defiance became an art form all its own. The world saw their painted smiles and graceful dances. But not the quiet endurance behind the curtain. The nightly negotiations between survival and self. In Yoshiwara, power was always borrowed, never owned. Samurai were not meant to fall in love there. They were men of duty and restraint, bound by loyalty and law. Yet Yoshiwara was designed to make them forget. For some, it became not a diversion but an ensnarement, a trap lined with perfume and silk. Affairs between courtesans and samurai were dangerous precisely because they were so common. For her, love could destroy the illusion that sustained her livelihood. For him, it could shatter honor, provoke scandal, and defy the strict class order of Tokugawa Japan. Samurai were expected to visit, indulge, and leave. Love was never meant to be part of the bargain. And yet, it happened. At times, a samurai would return again and again, spending beyond his means, composing secret haiku, and hiding love notes inside folded fans. Sometimes the courtesan would answer, a faint pressure of her hand, a verse slipped into his sleeve. These weren't mere affairs but quiet acts of defiance in a world where everyone wore a mask. The punishment, though, could be merciless. There were tales of samurai pawning their swords just to buy another evening together. Some lost rank, fortune, even life itself. A few, discovered in scandal, were commanded to commit seppuku, ritual death to cleanse dishonor. For the women, penalties ranged from humiliation to forced transfers into harsher houses. Yet the most sorrowful tales weren't of disgrace, but of endings steeped in despair. Lovers who saw no escape, no future, only the fading scent of incense and promises made too late. That's when tragedy took its final form. The double suicide pact known as Shinju. Two souls bound by forbidden love, choosing death over another dawn apart. In Yoshiwara, such romances bloomed like cherry blossoms, radiant, brief, destined to fall. In a place where every glance was rehearsed and every touch had its cost, love could survive only in silence, between words, between breaths. And in Yoshiwara, it was words, not whispers, that kept those loves alive. Poetry wasn't mere pastime, it was a secret tongue. Haiku, tanka, and short verses drifted through the quarters like petals, traded between geisha, courtesans, and their patrons, carrying emotions too dangerous to speak. A carefully crafted poem hidden in a sleeve could hold an entire heart without ever naming love. For courtesans, verse was part of their schooling. They were trained to spin grace from longing, wit from ache. A woman might answer a client's confession with a poem of distant moons or uncrossable rivers. But if she returned his affection, Her reply became a thread of hope, a quiet vow shared beneath the hum of lanterns. Samurai, poets, even noblemen sought Yoshiwara not only for pleasure, but for the art of poetic combat, verses exchanged like blades. Precise and dangerous. Love letters weren't crude tokens, they were crafted. Masterpieces, perfumed and folded with ritual care. Yet each poem was perilled. A letter discovered by a madam could lead to punishment. A client seen lingering too long near one house risked exposure. And if a samurai's lord heard rumors, ruin was certain. Still, the poems survived. Some were recorded in journals, printed in anthologies, or copied by later lovers seeking the same desperate beauty. Others vanished in flame before sunrise, their ashes scattered like secrets too dangerous to keep. In a world where affection was bought and sold, poetry let it breathe, fragile, fleeting, forbidden, something real enough to hold for a heartbeat beneath candlelight. For most women of Yoshiwara, freedom wasn't a dream but an equation. They lived by numbers, debts for training, kimonos, meals, and lodging, all tallied and growing. The only escape was misadashi, the act of being bought out. A patron, a merchant, a retired warrior, could pay the sum and claim her release. It sounded romantic, and sometimes it was, but more often it meant exchange, not liberation, one golden cage traded for another. Some found true rescue, married into comfort, or faded quietly into rural peace. Others became concubines, mistresses, or hidden wives, displayed only when convenient. Even in freedom, few were equal. Then there were those who fled. Such stories rarely ended kindly. The district was guarded, watchful. Those caught were shamed, paraded, shorn, or reassigned to the lowest brothels. Yet now and then a woman vanished entirely, disguised as a servant, smuggled away by a lover ready to gamble everything. Their tales spread through tea houses and stages, retold in kabuki plays as legends of love and loss. Freedom, they said, was possible, but never free. Still, the hope of escape never died. It survived in whispered songs, in hidden poems, in the dreams beneath the tatami floor. Because every courtesan lived two lives. The one she performed, and the one she imagined when the lanterns dimmed. A name she owned again, a love unpriced. Escape was rare. Redemption rarer still. But in a world built on illusion, hope was the one luxury no tax could reach. Among Yoshiwara's tales, none haunts like Shinju, the lover's suicide. These were not myths spun for theater, though kabuki immortalized them, but true acts of desperation. When love was forbidden, debt insurmountable, and society unyielding, death became a door no one could lock. The ritual was often the same. The courtesan, trapped by contract. The lover, bound by family or class, secret. Meetings, final letters, a shared cup of tea, then a vanishing into the night. They met by rivers, in forests, or rented rooms. Some cut their throats, others sank beneath canals bound by silk. Their bodies were found entwined, untouched by the world that condemned them. Officials denounced the acts, enforced new restrictions, and banned their depiction on stage. But the public could not look away. These deaths became elegies. Verses of sorrow painted in blood and petals. Plays like The Love. Suicides at Amijima turned despair into cultural legend. Audiences wept, poets mourned, and artists carved beauty from grief. Behind the art was truth, people so confined by duty that only death could offer choice. Not all courtesans met that fate. Most endured, aged, and sipped quietly from the floating world. But those who perished for love etched themselves into Japan's memory, written in blood ink. And falling blossoms. In a world obsessed with performance, Shinju was the only act that couldn't be faked. In Yoshiwara's candlelit haze, art was rebellion. Every fluttering fan, every stroke of ink, every folded kimono was a declaration of self in a world built to silence it. Courtesans and geisha were trained to embody beauty, intellect, and composure. Ideals forged through discipline, not privilege. Their artistry wasn't submission. It was defiance disguised as grace. A perfect bow. A flawless poem, each whispered, I still exist. I still choose how I am seen. Their art outlived them. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e. Pictures of the floating world, captured their faces, preserving their elegance for centuries to come. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaro and Suzuki Harunobu preserved their world in fragments. A woman fixing her hairpin. A geisha gazing through paper screens. Lovers meeting beneath drifting petals. These moments became adored across Japan, treasured by peasants and nobles alike. They turned courtesans into icons, and quietly revealed the loneliness beneath their grace. Some women became muses, their faces appearing in paintings, on stage, and in whispered novels. Their verses were printed in slim booklets, traded like jewels among scholars. For a few, art offered something rare, a voice. Yet the beauty could never show the truth. Behind every print stood a woman in debt. Behind every poem, a contract. Behind each soft smile, someone marking the days until freedom or age claimed her. Still, art gave what society denied them, a sense of authorship. It let them shape fragments of their story. In a place built to own them, even a fragment was rebellion. In Yoshiwara, beauty was currency and countdown both. Every painted face, every silken sleeve carried its own ending. Outside, people praised the courtesans as emblems of grace and allure. Inside, all knew the truth. Youth was the business, and it vanished quickly. A woman's worth began to fade the moment she shone brightest. Her bookings slowed. Her admirers grew old. New girls appeared, younger, trendier, hungrier. Like a lantern dimming with dawn, her glow receded until it disappeared. There was no grand farewell. No ceremony, no applause. Some left quietly, debts paid, opening tea houses or working as hairdressers. Others stayed in shadows, teaching novices, arranging hair, or managing guests. Many simply vanished, expelled once their illusions no longer sold. A fortunate few were redeemed before time caught them, purchased by a wealthy patron, married, or kept in comfort. But even rescue could mean another kind of cage. For those who aged without a sponsor, survival meant reinvention, often degrading in a society that prized beauty above all. Rarely, an ex-courtesan rose again as an okami, mistress of an inn or tea house, using wit and connections to endure. But these were exceptions. Most left Yoshiwara with little but memory and a folded kimono. No artist carved their faces once the blush faded. No poet praised wrinkled hands or tired eyes. The same world that had adored them erased them the moment youth slipped away. And yet, there was honesty in those silent departures. The illusion dissolved, the silk put away, the smile finally unnecessary. For in Yoshiwara, tragedy wasn't only in lost love or fleeting youth, it was in the silence that followed. When the music stopped, candles died, and the woman behind the mask walked home, unseen. Today, Yoshiwara's lanterns no longer burn. The narrow lanes once filled with laughter and song are now lined with apartments and neon signs. Yet the stories still linger like smoke. The district officially closed in 1958, when prostitution was outlawed in Japan. By then, Yoshiwara was already fading, bombed and broken during the war, its jeweled houses and perfumed salons reduced to ashes. With them vanished thousands of unrecorded lives. But Yoshiwara never truly died. Its spirit breathes through kabuki plays, woodblock prints, novels, and poems still studied in classrooms. The grand Oiran processions are reenacted each year, with women donning towering wigs and layered kimonos to honor the past. Few remember the names, but the courtesans endure in memory, not only as entertainers, but as survivors, poets, quiet revolutionaries. Modern Japan wrestles with their legacy. They are romanticized as symbols of beauty and mystery, yet their pain remains hidden beneath silk and nostalgia. Their truths are blurred, not just women painted in crimson, but children once sold into bondage. Artists who turned performance into resistance. Lovers who risked all for a taste of something real. Perhaps that is why their spirits still wander. Locals whisper of women seen drifting through old alleys, kimonos trailing, searching for what was lost. Others say the air around former brothels holds an uncanny stillness, as if the past refuses to vanish entirely. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, one truth remains: Yoshiwara is part of Japan's soul, a memory of illusion and loss, sorrow and splendor, beauty that flickered and never quite went dark.